India's foreign trade crossed the $1 trillion mark in December 2022, a first. However, India remains a net importer, which means India imports a lot more than it exports. India's exports are almost 40% more than its total imports. India's imports for the calendar year 2022 stood at $723 billion, whereas India's exports last year were half its imports that stood at $453 billion. US and China emerge as two of India's biggest trading partners. While India's trade balance with the US is healthy, India's trade imbalance with China is a cause of worry. India's net exports from China crossed the record $100 billion mark last calendar year, with total trade amounting to $118 billion. Even more worryingly, India's exports to China came down by a massive 38% during the same period, whereas the imports grew by 22%. Commenting on India's growing trade deficit with China despite frosty ties, India's External Affairs Minister S. Jaishankar reminded the industry leaders that
the responsibility here is not just of the government, it's an equal responsibility of businesses. If we have today a huge imbalance of trade with China, now again, anybody doing trade will not have a problem with an imbalance per se. It is nobody's contention, unless you are Donald Trump, that every trade account must be accurately balanced. Economics doesn't work that way. But when there is this kind of imbalance, where comparative advantages do not matter at all, where there are a lot of non-market factors at play, that production is determined by non-market factors, but you are giving entry on the basis, giving market access, assuming that this is some kind of market competition. So there's something fundamentally flawed here. And as I said, a lot of it depends on Indian corporates. That Indian corporates haven't developed the kind of backwards vendor supplies and components and parts and ingredients and intermediates that should be supporting us. Again, you could argue maybe the government didn't do enough. I think that's a reasonable point. So we are today trying to change this. When you look, when you say Atmanirbhar Bharat, it's not a slogan. It's actually a messaging to industry, to people saying, please, what you can source from India, you have an obligation to source, not as a moral obligation. Our national security is a threat if we have this kind of massive external exposure. And we saw that very graphically during COVID. So, today when we do PLI, production-linked incentives, the purpose of it is to bring back, we have to create a manufacturing culture in this country.
India's international trade grew by 15% on an average in the last 10 years. But what's worrying about the growth is that both India's exports and imports have become more concentrated or limited to fewer countries. In 2022, 14% of India's imported goods came from China, 17% higher than the previous year's $87 billion. China singularly dominates India's imports. India's net imports from China are double the size of next importer on the list, UAE, at $52 billion. Furthermore, India's exports to China in 2022 were valued at $15.15 billion, almost 34% lower than last year's $23.05 billion. To counter India's widening trade imbalance, government's efforts to promote manufacturing under the Atmanirbhar initiatives will have to fill this widening gap sooner rather than later, as India's export growth strategy is largely tilted towards manufacturing, something that the country will take a while to develop a comparative advantage in.